Yes, we are live again. Now the sixth time we've got the JCU Posthuman Studies Workshop, and it's the second part of the season dedicated basically to animaloids and plantoids. It's dedicated to the latest reflections on art and the posthuman. And we've got a cast which is absolutely amazing. We've got a lineup which is really groundbreaking for this specific topic. I'm amazingly excited about tonight, about the reflections we're going to hear. And as part of a long time and long-standing tradition we've established a couple of years ago at John Cabot University. I mean, the whole thing goes back. I've organized a conference series on posthumanism, transhumanism, metahumanism, all the related issues since 2009 on an annual basis. Then afterwards, it was realized that we started the Journal of Posthuman Studies in 2017 in cooperation with Penn State University Press. That's the first double-blind and peer-reviewed journal explicitly dedicated to the posthuman. It's being published, yes, online and in print. And furthermore, and it was launched also as part at John Cabot University, and it was launched in 2017 at the Beyond Humanism Conference Series, which took place here in Rome in the summer of 2017. And afterwards, we started some book series and many other events which were dedicated and deal with various aspects of the posthuman. So tonight we're going to reflect on various further aspects concerning posthuman art. And yes, Prunella, please share your thoughts with us.
Okay, yes, actually, it's the sixth time that we challenge ourselves and our friends about these seminal issues about the blurring of distinctions between natural and technological, artificial and cultural. So all the distinctions that were posed by Western culture due to the scientific paradigm that actually distinguished itself from the techniques, the technicians, the mechanics, and whatever was not considered high enough to deserve the status of science. All of this now has come to an end. Actually, this is the second part of a workshop that we had already in the spring. In the spring, our keynote speaker was Josh Bongert, scientist who has created an organism. So for the first time, a scientist works as a creative artist. In this time, instead, we have artists working as scientists, and this interconnection actually reminds me of the Renaissance, in which artists started to work as scientists. As Alberti said, artists should be scientists now. We'll talk more about that. Anyway, the Renaissance was clearly a time in which artists anticipated the science, the experimental science of Galileo. Renaissance artists were the avant-garde of the time, using the technologies of the time, like geometric perspective and maybe a camera already. And from this time on, we witness a revival today of a Renaissance spirit in which a scientist can be an artist can be a scientist. So this is our challenge today. Can we start with Eduardo Cach?
Yes. It's great. Maybe a brief comment to everyone. Feel free to post your comments in the chat section next to the YouTube video, and then we will be able to move the questions and address the question to the speakers, and thus also establish a dialogue between the people in front of YouTube and the participants here in the studio. Yes, Prunella, please.
Okay, Eduardo Cacho doesn't need to be introduced. From Brazil, experimental artist in performance, poetry, telepresence, biotelematics, transgenic interventions. Of course, he challenges the traditional distinctions between animal, plant, human, and robotics. So I welcome Eduardo Cacho, and it's an honor for us to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. I am now sharing my screen, and hopefully you can see my splash page with the title BioArt. I coined the term BioArt in 1997 in the context of this artwork entitled Time Capsule. In the context of this work, I became the first human ever to be implanted, in this case to self-implant, with a digital microchip that you see here on the left, and on the right you have a cluster of images that represent the different facets of this work. You see here the needle that I used to introduce the microchip. You see the moment in which I'm doing that. This was broadcast live on television and live on the internet. You see this live on television, but you also see the webcam that was used for the web transmission and the remote control of the scanner that allowed for the retrieval of the microchip, which you see inside my body in this X-ray. I did this in front of 7 sepia-tone photographs that represented my family in Poland in 1939. There is no reference to anything personal on the walls or anywhere in the work, because we all have images like this in our families. So ultimately, not only are we talking about the erasure of the skin as this boundary that separates the living body, the biological body, from the digital environment, but we are also problematizing the relationship between analog memories and digital memories. So having, in a sense, integrated the biological and the technological in Time Capsule, I focused more clearly what I wanted to develop within this new platform, this new art form of BioArt, with my artwork Genesis from 1999. Here you see a photograph of its premiere at Ars Electronica in Linz in Austria in 1999. And on the left wall, you have the DNA of that encodes the biblical sentence that you see on the right side. Projected on the wall, you see the bacteria that are, the process is illustrated here in this diagram. So I took a sentence from the book of Genesis, translated it into Morse code, created my own code that allowed me to convert the natural language into a DNA sequence. In the gallery, you have a setup. In the center of the gallery, you have a setup that is a ultraviolet light box, which you see on the right. And you have a camera and you have white light. So remote participants in the gallery or at home could activate the UV light and create a mutation in the living bacteria that is in the passage from the book of Genesis that I encoded into DNA, as you see on the left. The result, the result is that you could be sitting comfortably at home, and if the work, for example, is on view in Tokyo, which it was at the Yokohama Triennale, you could be in New York changing the word of God in the body of the living bacteria in Tokyo. Or you could be doing this from using your phone, you could be mobile. The point is that the small local gesture has a very significant amplified impact on the other side of the world inside the living organism. If you consider what I described here, we go from text that is on the computer screen that goes into the body of a living organism. And then I brought this back to the laboratory, and I was able to decode the mutations. So you have input, you have processing, and you have output happening within a living body. This retrieval of information that started digitally on the screen and goes through this process in the living body and comes back to the screen also shows that the boundaries between the living and the non-living, the biological and technological, the erasure of these boundaries is not just a metaphor. It's a physical fact, and it's also, in the case of my bioart practice, a paramount aesthetic element. In the year 2000, I created GFP Bunny. And in the context of this work, I created, using GFP, green fluorescent protein, I created a mammal that glows green under blue light, just as the bacteria of Genesis glowed green under blue light. This is the first mammal invented through biologically living mammal in the history of art. So we know from tradition that artists have, not only artists, but others as well, have imagined fantastic creatures. But here we have a situation in which we go from mythology to medium. The artist conceives a new biological entity and then sets in motion a process to bring this new mammal into the world. This work has celebrated now more than 20 years, and I may, in this case, point our audience in the direction of this article that I published in the Journal of Posthuman Studies that Stefan mentioned in the beginning at the opening of our presentation tonight. In this article entitled GFP Bunny at 20, I reflect on the transformations, the cultural impact, the reception, the ways in which GFP Bunny has been absorbed by cultural practitioners in general, but pop culture in particular. So, for example, on the right side, you see the green glowing bunny as it appears in Hounds of Baskerville in the famous television series Sherlock. But GFP Bunny has been absorbed in a lot of different ways as well. We see the green glowing rabbit in Smurfs, 2017, the Sony movie. We also see it on the cover of a Gallimard novel by Olivier Cadieux, who opens the novel with the green rabbit running through the fields. We see it here, for example, in Simpsons, the green glowing bunny as they appear in Simpsorama in 2014. Margaret Atwood has mentioned that she appropriated Alba, the GFP bunny, as a character in her novel Oryx and Crake. This is the cover of the first British edition from 2003. So GFP bunny has been absorbed in a lot of different ways that we could spend a significant amount of time discussing, but I will then switch to my third piece of bioart, transgenic art, in which I use GFP. These three pieces, Genesis, GFP Bunny, and the Eighth Day together, they form my creation trilogy. In the creation trilogy, I have worked continuously with GFP and only in these three works. On the left, you see the work as you would encounter at the end of a dark space, and the sound of water washing ashore would be heard. And on the right, you see, to give us a sense of scale, you see viewers approaching the work, and then they're stepping on images of moving water. So viewers are walking on water as they approach the Eighth Day. This gives you, on the left, a global view of this environment in which we have green glowing mice, as you see on the right. We also have green glowing amoeba living inside this biobot. This is a biological robot that is partially controlled by the movement of the amoeba, as you see on the right, and partially controlled by the movement of local and online participants. The element on the top of the biobot is the camera, the point of view, the eye of the biobot, and the amoeba control the legs of the biobot. So the overall observable behavior of the biobot results from the co-presence, the simultaneous presence of humans and amoeba in the body of the biobot, the amoeba controlling the legs and the humans controlling the eye of the biobot. Also, in this self-contained ecology, we have green glowing plants. Plants are green, but they do not glow. These do glow, they have GFP. And on the right, we have green glowing fish. So this environment is composed of green glowing mice, fish, amoeba, and plants, and the biobot, and the humans that are simultaneously inside and outside. This gives you a very brief, because the interface has many different pathways, but this gives you a view, the vintage view of the interface where you could choose the different points of view and activate the different points of view. This shows you the perspective of the biobot. And on the right side, the basic computer and hardware diagram making all this function on a digital level. Of course, we're not illustrating the biological aspect in this case, just the digital aspect of this work. And to bring us close to the end of my presentation, although I have created other pieces of bioart, I am going to conclude tonight with natural history of the enigma. You see here a plantimal, a living organism that in this case is a plant with an animal characteristic. And the animal characteristic here in this case is the fact that I have transferred a DNA fragment from my own blood and expressed it exclusively in the red veins of the flower. Here on the right side, you see a diagram that illustrates how this was done. But essentially, the key part is here is this plasmid that is under the control of a particular promoter that makes sure that my DNA goes only in the red veins. So this is a DNA transfer from my red veins to the red veins of this plantimal that I call Edunia because it used to be a petunia and once became a transgenic creature that nature did not produce, then it became an Edunia. And I like to exhibit the Edunias in direct contact with these other transgenic bipedal mammals that you see here in the photograph that we usually call humans. We have the tendency to think of the human as somehow excluded from the larger fabric of life. But with the Human Genome Project, we have come to understand that we have always had sequences in the human genome that came from viruses, from bacteria. We also have more bacterial cells than human cells in our bodies. So in reality, this entity that we call the human has always been a hybrid, has always been transgenic. So I think it's an emblematic image, this encounter between two different types of transgenic creatures. One that is the result of evolution, and the other is the result of the artistic act of creation of the work of the artist. And this is how I like to present it, basically enabling a dialogue, enabling contact, enabling the encounter of two different life forms. I have created a whole series of works. They're lithographs, they're sculptures. There are, on the right, we see the concluding piece in the series entitled Coda, which is a 14-layer lithograph that has the representation of the scientific process that confirms the presence of the transgene in the veins of the flower. Thank you.
Many thanks for this wonderful presentation. I've got one session in my posthuman studies course, always at least one, usually two sessions dedicated to bioart. And so many thanks for that wonderful presentation. I will definitely use this video as part of all my future posthuman studies courses from now on. And I know sort of also the students react intensely to the work you've created and are absolutely fascinated by it. At the same time, I must realize, and you've described that also very well in your article, in the article you wrote for the Journal of Posthuman Studies, that there's sort of in certain sectors of the art world there has been a hesitation, to embrace your works of art. And but I think sort of what fascinates me particularly about it is also sort of the aesthetics of hybridity, which you've just mentioned, which you and whose importance you just stressed. It is not just the aesthetics of the work of art you're presenting, but it always goes beyond that. It's a type of a non-totalitarian total work of art. It always has implications it has questions which are of contemporary relevance for the outside world with which we are currently confronted with. It presents an outlook concerning who we are as human beings, that we humans have always been hybrids, that we've more non-human entities as part of our body than human entities, that so many bacteria in our intestines. And that goes along with a new conception of who we are, of how we conceptualize ourselves. It's no longer the conception that we have that essence, that we have some divine spark, something, but we are such hybrid entities permanently interacting with the outside world. But the outside world is already part of us, with bacteria and so on, with non-human entities being part of who we are, being part of our permanent becoming. Would you regard this as a fair description, as an appropriate one, by dealing with your works?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you said goes hand in hand with my practice and my thinking. What is perhaps shocking to people is not new facts in themselves, but the realization that we have always been these hybrid creatures. I think this is what has initially shocked people. The fact that we have received culturally and historically a sense of the human in opposition to something else, because binary thinking, unfortunately, has informed culture for so long. So the human was in opposition to the animal, the human was in opposition to machines, and so on and so forth. And we have come to realize that these oppositions are false. This binary thinking is ideological rather than representing some essential quality or insight, as you pointed out as well. So we have to do away with binary thinking. This is something that I have been attacking since the very beginning of my practice in 1980. And we have to develop new ways of thinking. Networking, for example, is a useful model where there is no center, there is no hierarchy, everything is in connection with everything else, and everything affects and informs everything else. So this is something that I have pursued as well. The notion of network, not only as a noun, but as a verb. So I have been working online since 1985, and I've been also establishing these connections that I have demonstrated for the reasons that we have talked about.
I have, can I comment?
Please.
Actually, what you say is quite persuasive, of course, but when you say that you work with creation and light and the eighth day, I can understand the misunderstanding, because it's like claiming to be a god, so the creativity and the divine and the identification with the god has been analyzed so much. When photography came up, the usual complaint was that the artist claimed to be like a god. So do you feel like that when you are when you work with your creative ideas, do you feel like you're an instrument or the origin of your work?
No, there's nothing special in the sense about creating bioart. There's something very special, which is the fact that you're dealing with life, and you can't work with life in the same way that you work with inert materials. You have to understand that life needs to be respected. Life has its own logic, and there's an ethics that also informs the work. So in this sense, working with bioart is very different, is very special. But aside from that, there's nothing that is particularly different from, say, a painter or a sculptor. You're an artist, you have your creative process. A painter doesn't make her own brush or her own canvas. They acquire these instruments and they use them to create the work. So in this sense, it's not different. You are an artist and you have a creative process. You have an idea of what you want to do. Then you mobilize the resources to achieve your goals. You engage in a process, and then you produce output, and then you exhibit the results. So from an artistic point of view, it's the same as everything else. What is specific, what is different, what is unique is the fact that you cannot treat life the same way you treat paint. Because life demands responsibility, life demands ethical thought and action. So in that sense, it's very specific.
Mm-hmm.
And the non-duality, which you've been stressing, which is so this moving beyond the categorical ontological dualities, which is so strong in your work, and that has such an enormous relevance for our life world, because we must, and it goes along with this post-human paradigm shift, because it's still the case that most constitutions, most of our legal frameworks are still embedded in these dualistic structures, and with all the discriminatory implications as well, and getting rid of them, and it really, there's a need of bringing about such an enormous paradigm shift. That's why many people also find it highly, don't problematic, shocking, or have problems connecting to it, because we don't know even all the implication, all this getting rid of the dualities or moving beyond the traditional dualities have. But it is incredibly important to do so in order to avoid also the discriminatory structures which go along with the traditional duality. So it's really part of an enormous cultural twist which your works of art go along with, no? And
that's how I feel as well. Yes.
So I can only summarize. Basically, this is a comment we heard. Yeah, we've talked about from one of our watchers. We've talked about you, Eduardo, and your incredible pieces of artwork in some of my class. It's amazing to be able to hear directly from you. I share this entirely with the comment. So many thanks for your amazing presentation. Many thanks that you've been with us. And now we'll move to our next keynote speaker.
Okay, great. Nina Sellers from Australia. Nina Sellers from Australia. She is a research fellow and project manager at the School of Design and Art at Perth. She teaches at the Department of Anatomy at Melbourne University. And I hope I don't miss much. Maybe you can add something about it. Anyway, she's quite active in these fields in which anatomy actually becomes what was at the beginning. I mean, at the early modernity, Leonardo, anatomy was the work of a scientist artist, but we don't even have the word to express what they felt to be. These artists, scientists work on the same level. So Nina Sellers, welcome to Leonardo's country. I think that your work is quite Leonardesque.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll just say my internet is a little unstable, but please stay with me and seductively fill in any gaps that I have. And I will now try and share my screen. Okay. And hopefully this is nice for you. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you very much to the organizers, Brindele Antomarini, Stefan Lorenz Sogna, and Chrissy Soteriades for the very kind invitation to present for you today among such a nice collection of papers, and also doing so alongside the illustrious Eduardo Katz. It's a great honor. So I'm speaking to you today from Melbourne, Australia, and as such, it's important that I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking. So I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and to those who are currently emerging. So my paper may appear as a counterpoint to the discourses of the workshop, because the anatomy that I mention in my title is human anatomy. And I'll be lensing it through critical posthumanism and, of course, with the inclusion of art. And art is, or can be, the most exquisite delivery system for unsettling ideas and questions. I was going to change the title of my talk at one point because I seem to be much more about assembling delinquents rather than disassembling them. And delinquents for me are concepts, people, matters that offend well. So I go back to the etymological origin of the word delinquent, which is simply means offending. So, and with the ethical content of offending and offending well. To give you a little bit of background and history or context for my work, I obviously am an artist. But everything that I've done for the last 25 years has focused on the topic of anatomy, so human anatomy. And the way that I go about exploring anatomy is that I use different mediums to ask questions of anatomy. And here I should say also that when I'm speaking of anatomy, I'm not speaking less about the body per se, and more about anatomy as a discipline. So I'm very interested in the history, methods, and foundational ideas of the discipline. So in using mediums to ask questions of anatomy, you can think of each medium as having threads of affect and certain histories that set up the parameters for the questions that I'm able to ask from that particular perspective. So all I'm really doing is navigating around the topic of anatomy, and think of the mediums as ways of seeing, so situated perspectives that allow me to have a certain insight, and I can contrast them and look for convergences and divergences from certain ways of seeing. So just moving on to the idea of critical posthumanism. So in relation to anatomy, so for me, by paying close attention to the methods and history of anatomy, it allows me to seek out all the unheard voices and elements that in many ways have played key roles in constructing anatomy as a discipline, yet in themselves have remained unheard and unseen. So the line that I have at the bottom of this slide, an incision is also a decision, entailing an ethical imperative. I've actually taken and appropriated from my favorite media theorist, Joanna Zielinska, here working with Sarah Kemba for their text After New Media. And I relate it back to anatomy. For them, it relates to media and technology. But with anatomy, anatomy literally means to cut the body asunder. So at its etymological origins, this is what it means. So this line for me, I emphasize this, the decision part, the decisions that we make with every cut into the body, what informs those decisions. And the reason why I have this focus and why I think anatomy is so interesting is that anatomy really provides the background from which our contemporary understanding of the body arises. We very much see ourselves as anatomical bodies. And in doing so, I think it's important then to reflect back on the discipline and look for all the assumptions and omissions and biases that's embedded in this body of knowledge, and carefully consider what we're drawing up into our identity, especially when we start moving into notions of transhumanism and posthumanism. What do we want to actually take forward? And just be very careful of having an awareness of that. Just to reiterate, so we had ancient anatomy, but modern anatomy really starts with the Renaissance era in Italy. And since this time, anatomy has involved not only the physical cut of dissection, but also the visual cut of image making, which carves out a particular representation of the body. So keep in mind that anatomy is a science predominantly based on visual observation and relied on images for the circulation of that knowledge. So this sort of introduces why we should care as a community, as a society about these images, because they don't stay within a medical school, they circulate. And this speaks to the second piece of text that I have here. As anatomical images of the human body increasingly circulate in the current visual and media culture, they belong not only within the domain of scientific inquiry, but also exist in a creative field that helps to further define our human identity. So I'm about to introduce one of my favorite delinquents from anatomy, which is fat. I often describe it as a critical organ of posthumanism because it has this elegant ability to question the discipline of anatomy. It exceeds anatomy. It's very hard to contain it within a classification. And the way I'll introduce it is with one of my favorite images. I used to be a body dissector. So not only am I invested in anatomy in my arts practice, but it's been the main part of my career. So when I was working as a body dissector, there was often this view that somehow we just remove the skin and we arrive at the superficial layer of the muscles. And we don't. That's not what happens when you dissect a body. And the image I have on the right is a cross-section from the Visible Human project. So across the sort of thorax and arms, and you can see with all the organs and vessels removed, the layering of fat, that it cushions every single nerve, every single vessel, every organ within the body. But it doesn't really appear in the history of anatomy. So this becomes very, very problematic in the 21st century because fat is actually the most contested, instrumentalized, and commercialized organ of the body. And so not appearing within this history, when it's a visual history, not being in those archives, raises all sorts of issues. And it became very interesting in the 1990s when fat was actually reclassified as an organ. So it's now seen as an extended distributed organ of the endocrine system. But at the turn of the 21st century, it got even more complicated when it was found to have more pluripotent stem cells than bone marrow, so 400 times more pluripotent stem cells. So it has then the capacity to be able to differentiate it into different cell lineages. So you can grow bone tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, all the components of the body from this organ. So very elegantly, it goes from being a non-organ, so we can almost play with being non-human, into being an organ, to then being an organ that has the capacity to construct every single other tissue and organ of the body. And so I became very interested in researching this sort of story, and I don't do things by halves. So normally when I make an artwork, and this is why you're getting such a lead up to it, I do a lot of research. So I wanted to find the people that had discovered that the adipose-derived stem cells. And this led me to Ramon Uy, who at that time was living in Mallorca. And for the lovers of Catalan philosophy, he is actually a direct descendant of Ramon Uy, the 13th century philosopher. So as a student, he was working under Bill Futrell. And he was the one that discovered this. Well, it's happened in America, so it's actually an invention, not a discovery. It's got a patent connected to it. And I got drawn into a debate that was happening in 2016 because the FDA, they were making an application to the FDA to stop fat from being declared a drug. So it got pulled into the stem cell debate because it's very much used now in regenerative medicine. So fat has all these different definitions that should be cancelling itself out or cancelling each other out, but it doesn't. So they all exist suspended. And anatomy doesn't like not being able to place things into classifications. So part of the debate was fat was being classified as structural and non-structural. And what the FDA was using as their basis for this argument was anatomy textbooks, but fat doesn't really appear in the history of anatomy. So they were very generous in including me in a lot of these sorts of discussions. And at the same time, or about a year afterwards, I started back at Symbiotica, which is the Centre of Excellence for Biological Arts at the University of Western Australia. And I made this work called Sentinels. And what you're actually looking at on screen is a documentation image from an exhibition called Hyperprometheus, The Legacy of Frankenstein, that was co-curated with the people from Symbiotica. And it was held at the Perth Institute of Contemporary Arts. So what you can actually see are two very large projections. And these projections are about 3 meters tall. And they're showing you the contents inside this glowing sort of object in between them. So that object is an incubator, and inside that is a bioreactor. Inside that is this Kouros figure, or this Kouros that is made from a hydrogel. And the hydrogel is working as a matrix to support living pre-adipocyte cells. So adipose is the medical term for fat. So this is human fat that's growing within this figure. Why I chose the Kouros was because I wanted to emphasize that anatomy was an invention. So think about the 5th century BCE, and these figures came before that, because the figure on the right is actually the vial that I originally bought the cells from America in, and that's also located in the incubator. And with that, I was wanting to suggest perhaps we can think of a period post-anatomy, a more fluid conception of the body. So seductively, the label, what you could see visible, had primary subcutaneous normal human with a lot number, and also the instruction to store it at minus 130 degrees Celsius. And the context for this exhibition was beautiful for this work, since it was a celebration of Mary Shelley's, or the 200th anniversary of her Frankenstein novel. So I'll just very quickly... So this figure was actually being drip fed, and talking about the difficulties of showing biological artworks. You put a lot of effort to have life on display, and when it's tissue culture, it's often invisible, this life. So using metaphor in a way, so life is perceived as movement and moisture often. So I had this figure being drip fed its nutrients, and as it fell on the head, you can see on the image on the right, this electrical sort of flash of light would run down as the lighting caught this movement of moisture. There was a very beautiful discussion happening at the same time that I was making this work, because I had downloaded a copy of the Kouros from the Getty Museum at the very same time that the debate was happening, that it was actually a forgery. So it was being removed from view. You can't see it in the museum anymore, as my real copy was going on display at Pika in Perth. And it was taken off display, and it was shown to be a forgery, partly because of its perfection. So it wasn't because of a lack or a clumsiness of the work. It was a culmination of different styles and the perfection of its appearance. And I'll just very quickly show you what goes into making these biological artworks. So this is me working at the University of Western Australia at Symbiotica, and every time I need to go in to work with the cells, I had to get them from liquid nitrogen to take them into the lab. And I'll just very quickly show you, sorry, this is not going to work for me. As I'm coming close to time anyway, I won't show you the vision unless I can. Just show you elements, just because of this interest. I was going to say there's a lot of people that help you make these artworks. So this is Nathan Thompson, who was helping build the incubator. And this is the mold that I was using to create the figure. It's very hard to get hydrogel to stand up, so I had to find and devise ways of building inserts that would enable him to stand. And this is opening night, just to give you a little bit of idea of how large it was. So you were able to see the small figure in the incubator, but then also see the projections from afar. So it sort of drew you into this sort of alcove space on the side of the main museum space. And the thanks to everyone that's assisted. Okay, I'm just going to end again with the delinquent museum idea that I've been developing. I think in a way it was a conceptual space for me that then led into an openness to seeking out delinquents. People, ideas, matters that offend and offend well. And now I should say that I'm now working in a museum. I've slipped over again into the sciences. So I'm actually one of the curators. I'm the curator of exhibitions and programs at the Harry Brooks Allen Museum of Anatomy and Pathology inside the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Melbourne. And now that I'm in this space, and I've grown awareness, say, for example, with fat, that there hasn't been a lot of space for fat within our collections. It's not something that's really presented. It's made me think of other delinquents. So I'm hoping to have a museum space that embraces this etymological origin of delinquent and delinquency, and then also express that it has a twofold ethical imperative. Firstly, the necessity to offend, which is seen as a responsibility to question, and secondly, to do it well, that is thoughtfully. And so that's the part I'm really interested in, that often, for me, maybe doesn't get questioned enough when we do arts and sciences, is to keep critically engaging with our processes and to do these ideas very, very thoughtfully. And that just closes out to the last point, that it's to remain open to critique, to recognize the importance of doubt and listening, and to acknowledge that things change and that we could be wrong. And yeah, just to provide this place for these delinquents, and then also cultivate principles that can help us develop future delinquents. So I think I'll leave it there and try and
Many thanks for that. Many thanks for that wonderful presentation. I was particularly happy actually when you sort of started mentioning also the post-anatomical, sort of, because and as you said, sort of when you started talking, the anatomical still presumes sort of a specific perspective, a duality between the perceiver and the perceived, classifying the body in a specific manner. There's a finger, there's a heart, there's the eye, there's a nose. But if you move beyond from a critical posthumanist perspective and take the non-duality into consideration, and you start blurring the boundaries, one could conceptualize the body in an entirely different manner. Each conceptualization is already an encrusted structure. It is a duality which gets created. It's the finger and the rest. And I'm curious actually, sort of whether you could say something more about this idea of post anatomy, in the sense in which you use it, in which you embrace it in your work. It's a topic. It's actually a concept I'm using as well in my reflection. So I'm very curious about hearing more from you.
I think I almost mean it just as a provocation and also a realization how, I mean, because I work as an anatomical illustrator as well, and that's something I should say. I don't.
Connections.
Maybe there's a connection. The provocation concerning the post-anatomical was a bit too...
Echo here.
I think you were briefly interrupted. The provocation with the post-anatomical didn't want to be heard.
Yeah.
Maybe you could repeat.
Yeah. I think I mean it as a provocation, but I think it's also I want people to realize that it's very much a 16th century view of the body that we have. Okay. And that's why I seek out these matters that actually challenge the boundaries and classifications. Even if we can just have, because every sort of negotiation of a boundary offers up the possibility for a conversation about what goes into those sort of boundaries. I don't know how hard it will be to get away from wanting to close classifications. Like it's, I mean, that's why I love fat, because it exists in all these multitude of different areas, but there's no benign study of fat. Like we don't have adipology. Like you have neurology for the nervous system, you have cardiology for the heart, but there is no adipology. So this is why I keep returning to it, because of the conversations, and I have no desire to see it be slammed down into a classification. I think the beauty of it, I think in trying to classify it as an organ, people were trying to draw it in to silence it in a way. It's a way of saying, oh, well, now you're part of the group, you can be quiet now. I think there's value in not having it closed. So the idea of the post-anatomy is just at least to have that realization of how strict and how old this vision is of the body.
Mm. So. And by the way, the fat. I mean, I really like. I thought you would reply and refer to fat in that perspective, because it moves around at different places. It's less
Beautiful.
clearly categorizable as the other bodily parts, as the other parts of the anatomy. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy that it's able to fit. It's resided within the body, the physical body, but it's been outside the schema of the anatomical body. But if we identify ourselves as anatomical bodies comprised of organ, that's the definition of an anatomical body. And now that the FDA debates are happening, you know, it's gone from being this non-organ to being an organ that can make all other organs, to now, with its brush up against technology with the stem cell debate, it's now classified maybe as a drug, you know. So, but it's not left any of the classifications. It just hovers in there, and it's beautiful. It's a fantastic way of interrogating anatomy. So,
I like it a lot.
And I have two questions. Do you think that the new technologies could help in overcoming the paradigm of the anatomy, helping in a paradigm shift, overcoming the analytic, that is anatomic cutting of bodies? Let's say, considering more deeply the interconnection of all the organs and all the parts into a whole.
Yeah, I mean, thinking less in practical terms, but just even the questions that they raise, the connection with technologies. I mean, I think it's Catherine Walby that talks about anatomy really being a science that allows the body to be connected to instruments. But it's more the conversations and the that I think is really interesting. I mean, because I work in visuals, I find it very interesting working in an anatomy school that there's this emphasis now on maybe moving away from using the physical body and using images. But then when we have this issue that all these assumptions and biases that are embedded in this way of seeing should be really treated as a map and a guide, and now become the actual object of observation. So students often don't have that interaction to deal with the physical body. I'm probably diverging away from your question, but yes. Can I just say yes? I think, yeah. I think it will. I think it does. There's lots of wonderful things and problems. I love problems. I love paradoxes, and that's exactly what fat is. It's a paradox. It's a paradox.
Yeah, I have another question. I like this expression, the necessity of offending, the necessity of offend. Could you expand on that? Because, you know, delinquency, offending, cutting the body, all of this as a necessity. What do you mean by necessity? Do you think?
So I don't see cutting the body as a necessity, but I see the necessity to offend is a social responsibility to question, especially things. See, within the sciences, anatomy is actually considered a dead science, and I don't mean a science of the dead. I mean that it's a known thing, and obviously for us all in the arts and humanities, this is instantly raises a flag, because it's like, now we enter. You know, now that you think this is all known, so the idea of offending is the social, ethical, or social responsibility to question, but to do it well is the ethical component, and to often arts and sciences coming together is seen as enough. But I think there almost has to be this, maybe a meta step, where we have to always go back and critique exactly what we're doing and how we're doing it. So that's the extra step. And I wanted to have a space where people, you know, can enter and have these discussions within the context of a museum, within, you know, say, for example, in our anatomy and pathology museum.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And it also had a quite. I was just invited as a speaker to the World Congress of Anti-Aging and Plastic Surgery Medicine in Monte Carlo. So that also had a very big relevance, but that was obviously a different context.
Yeah, you know what was great? When I went to the conference in America, it was just, I thought I was going to be there landing with Hillary Clinton as president, and it wasn't. I landed just a few days after Trump had become president. But the collection that within these conferences are brilliant. You've got people that are doing regenerative medicine, radiation treatment, because the cytokine cascade of fat heals wounds. But then you've got people doing Brazilian butts, the multitude of people working with fat all gathered in one room, and they couldn't have been more different, so it was beautiful. And plastic surgeons now treat fat as their organ, which is also very beautiful, because plastic surgeons is one of the specialities that doesn't have a designated organ. So they're perfectly married, that there's, very hard to define an area for fat. And then plastic surgeons come in and say, well, this is our organ, so.
Many thanks for your wonderful presentation and question and answer session. Hopefully we'll be meeting up again very soon.
Yes, yes, that would be lovely. Ciao.
Ciao, I will. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the co-organizer of the event. Actually, was Professor Brunella Antomarini. We started the entire series, the JCU workshop series on posthuman studies a few years ago, and she's here, the one at John Cabot University. She teaches philosophy, in particular, which is a special field of expertise, the philosophy of art and aesthetics. So I'm particularly happy to be able to introduce her today, and that I'm very much looking forward to what she will have to say about posthuman art and aesthetics. So the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Stefan. Yes, after Eduardo and after Nina, of course, the question that comes to mind is what does artist mean? What does it mean to be an artist now, after so many changes and metamorphoses that the identity of an artist has taken? I would say globally, because actually we in modernity have started to project or to retroact on what we have called in the Western world the art, what was not actually called art. In fact, art is a modern term. There was no concept of the kind until modernity. What we call art was called in Greek techne, which is actually closer to technique. So whatever the artist does, if we want to give the widest possible definition of it, is a human being, even an animal, working or manipulating matter. And this can be done in many different ways. So all back to classifications and distinctions that are actually cultural and not obvious and not objective. Actually, there is no difference in between creating something out of nothing, as Plato would claim, and making something with matter. The distinction was actually post-Leonardesque. Leonardo himself wouldn't define himself as an artist. He cared a lot about being considered an engineer. So when he presented himself, there is a document of a letter he wrote to the governor of Turkey, proposing himself as an engineer, saying that he was able to make bridges and the buildings, whereas he was actually unable to make bridges. He never did make any bridge. Together with Machiavelli, they went to Pisa in order to they made the plan to deviate the water from Pisa to Florence, the river from Pisa to Florence, in order to win over the city of Pisa. They failed. This is interesting. They failed. There's a wonderful book called "The Fortune is a River" about this failure. The fact that Leonardo failed is so meaningful for my question about what does artists mean, because Leonardo doesn't consider himself the product of an artistic definition of art. He considers himself one who who tests matter, and this is exactly why he can fail. He's famous for leaving a painting or a fresco in the middle of the work. He was famous to make a decision whether to finish a work or not, a bronze statue or not. And all of this tells us a lot about what an artist can be. An artist is exactly what doesn't accept to have any predetermined definition. So in the Middle Ages, the artist was the maker of frescoes, so considered simply an artisan. He was paid for doing some work, exactly as a carpenter would do, his work. They didn't even sign their works. In the Renaissance, during the possibility to apply mathematics to painting, this is, I think, the moment in which Leonardo's model is replaced by the pure artist. A pure artist is one who doesn't work so much with matter, but needs and makes a decision to work with an intellectual idea. Sorry, my computer's going. An intellectual idea that accompanies the manipulation of matter. This intellectual idea was geometric perspective, and this is what for the first time turns an artist into a scientist. And this is the moment in which there's a first separation between the artist working for the pleasure of working, and this is the moment in which they sign their works, and the scientist who works with mathematics much more than with matter. The technicians, the legacy, the heirs of the techne, of the activity of techne, start being considered secondary and useless. Now, what happens? The romantic figure of the artist develops furtherly. The artist is the one who doesn't stand any regularity and therefore any scientific work. The figure now is ready to do what we call art, that is the modernity of the making for the sake of making. On the other side, the scientists don't consider themselves as so creative as they must follow rules. This is why Kant says artists can be geniuses, scientists can't. What happens now after the so-called digital culture, new technologies, post-digital, which means, as Eduardo and Nina showed, the introduction of the technologies inside of the biology, inside of life. At this point, I don't know what art or what artist means if we still consider the old categories. Actually, we need now to have even a new word to define this reunified activity, in the sense that it is scientific and artistic at the same time. So if, and here I'm quoting Luhmann, art is exactly what tries to deny itself. Art is what defines itself by denying all the previous productions. This is the very moment in which art can deny itself in order to cause a completely new definition of this kind of activity. And this is in this kind of new paradigm, we can go back to Leonardo. Thank you.
Many thanks. Great, Brunella. This is actually sort of what you've referred to. This is actually a thought which I'm playing around with. I'm currently writing a manuscript on the philosophy of posthuman art, which is nearly completed. And sort of one of the central aspects was also sort of going back to the traditional concept. No, art in ancient Greece with techne using standing for art, as there was not a separate concept of the fine arts. and techne also being used as sort of the functional term of the engineers who realized something for a practical purpose. There was no distinction. And then as part of the further development, as part of the further development, in particular during the Middle Ages, so it's this separation. Suddenly the art was there, the art in the sense of the fine art, what we would call fine arts. The arts are there to represent the eternal, to represent the divine, to represent eternal, unchanging truths. And then on the other hand, there was the engineer, the technologist who's got the role of realizing bridges and buildings and doing something for a practical purpose. And which has a strong dualistic implication between the immaterial and the material world. And now, would you agree with this analysis or this understanding, sort of with techne and techne in the sense of technology and art getting reunited? It is also again at the same, the boundaries get blurred between the functional and the ones what is intrinsically, it's what is aesthetically being perceived. Both neither the functional exists without the aesthetic, nor the aesthetic without the functional in a sense, because this is what this non-duality implies. It is also the erosion of the clear boundaries between what used to be separated, what used to be there as having, this is only in order to achieve a goal, or this is primarily in order to represent eternal truth. And now these two concepts get twisted in a way, and they lose their clear, rigid boundaries.
Yes, it's on the one side we see that an artist is also a scientist can also a technician, can also be a technician. They can be poets, as Eduardo shows, but at the same time, activities become more and more complex. So I see also a development toward artists working in teams, because, for instance, if they need to work with digital programs, with algorithms, they need programmers. And I see many artists working in teams. I see, for instance, poetry being worked through digital devices. I don't know if he's present here. Gabriele Estera is an example of this kind of poet. I see painters working with in collaboration with algorithms. Alessandro Gianni, I have a painting over there that he's made in collaboration with the algorithm. He lends his paintings to a program, and the algorithm gives him advice as to how to develop the painting itself. We can imagine, we have electronic music in which now, algorithms try, however very rudimentary, to make songs, and all of these makes me think that artists may lose the connotation of this narcissistic, solitary, irregular genius, and starts being a more, I wouldn't say pragmatic, but I would say more, with a kind of sobriety that is allowed by working in teams. Cinema, of course, is a kind of first example, paramount example of this working in teams. So on the one side, as you say, there's the overcoming of the distinction. On the other side, we see something that never existed before, I think, like a group, for instance, the algorithm, the painting algorithm is a group of people. Okay, so I see this, the replacement, no Andy Warhol. I can't imagine another Andy Warhol in the future, but I can imagine a community, small communities, making something that is as surprising as Andy Warhol.
Many, many thanks. We do have questions also coming in the chat, also concerning the former speakers. So I guess concerning the former speakers, we will do maybe a session at the very end where we can discuss among ourselves, as well as having additional questions from the audience via the chat. But I also have a question from Professor Conti. So in other words, while in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, but also in the classical age, the artist had precise canons to respect. Today, it seems that everything can be or become art. And the question is, as a second part, is this the case, or are the artistic canons simply changing?
Interesting question, because Duchamp, said explicitly anything can be art, showing bottle racks and urinals. At this point, that doesn't mean that canons do not exist. Canons, a canon is actually a Greek word that simply meant if you want to give this product, you have to choose, you have to follow this rule. Algorithms have always been there. Canon means algorithm, means the rule according to which something can be achieved. The matter is not to renounce any rule. Of course, rules are always there. Even in showing a urinal, there is a rule. The difference is that the canon has become increasingly experimental. This is why the radical experimentation that artists do now or have done since the early 20th century remind me of Leonardo, exactly because when you make an experiment, you do not know whether this experiment will succeed or not. This is why Leonardo is a model, because he failed. So his failures are as important as his successes. If you follow a canon, you're not an artist because you know what you must do. In the Middle Ages, what we call artists weren't artists. They weren't called artists in the sense that they had a different role and they simply were artisans. So canon, following a canon means that you are doing nothing new, nothing surprising, nothing that challenges or protects from nature, because this is why we have technologies. Or canon may mean I invent my own canon, my own algorithm, in order to reach where nobody else has reached before. So canon means two things in this case. One is predetermination, which has nothing to do with what we call art, or experimentation, which has gone, has increased over time until now, since the Renaissance.
This is absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with Professor Conti's comment and want to thank you as well for your brilliant answer and wonderful presentation. And yes, I hope you will now then present our next speaker as well.
Our next speaker is Alain Borioli, Italian origin but Swiss, from Lausanne. Aladdin was a student of mine in an interesting course of international scope about cybernetics. Cybernetics in the Renaissance, and Aladdin, I don't know, as an incredibly interesting work. He's interested in beehives. He has a kind of family tradition of making beehives, but his anthropological work with beehives over history and also concerning the actual objects, beehives, now has become interested, concerned with the technologies allowing to understand and to study those bees more deeply. So thank you very much, Aladdin, to contribute to this discussion.
Thank you, Brunella. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation, and thank you also to all the organizers of the event. So I will briefly introduce you my short presentation and then dive into it. So as Brunella said, I've been working with bees and on the question of bees for many years now, and I like to say that I work on the kind of a communal project called Apian, which I like to call a sort of a ministry of bees, or like a non-profit bureau that aims to investigate our age-old interspecies relationship that we have been developing with bees. In the introduction text for this workshop, it was mentioned that exploration into other worlds, like other Umwelten or non-human worlds, are a way to overcome anthropocentrism. And I would like to add that's also always at the end a way to understand ourselves better. So as a sort of comparative method, it's what I use mostly in my research as well. And yeah, I also believe that through bees and we can explore human relationship with bees, and we can explore like the downfall of anthropomorphism and learn more about ourselves. So today I will share one project, part of this larger research project called Apian, that touch upon the question of technology, and some questions that have been developed already tonight and that will develop further after. So the presentation I will give you first a brief overview of the context where this project inscribes itself within beekeeping practices nowadays. And then we will see the status of this technology that I'm working with, the downside and pros and cons, basically, and then we explore a project, the project that is the project of the center of the presentation, called the Intimacy Machine. It's a project I developed quite recently in collaboration with two designers, Arie Blok and Joris Lenmel from Amsterdam, and also a visual anthropologist, Ellen Lapper. And this was developed through different artistic residency, but especially at Labec, which is in Switzerland, and at iBeam, which is situated in New York, but which has switched online during the pandemic. So the machine, or as I like to call it, is like two folds, and it aims first to provide access to the world of bees via forms of intimacy, but without proximity, the idea of touchlessness, intimacy. And secondly, it's also a more practical project which aims to build a sort of a blueprint for a better use of digital technology or information technology in the realm of beekeeping nowadays. So to give you some context, because it maybe sound a bit obscure from outside. So recently, something that we call smart hive or electronic monitored beehive have starting to infiltrate the beekeeping practices. And broadly speaking, it is the idea to use digital sensor to help beekeepers to learn from a distance, from afar, what's happening inside their hives. So to give you a more clear example, we could say that a hive is placed upon an electronic scale, and the scale measures the increase or decrease in weight of the hive. This ultimately helps beekeepers to know if bees are harvesting honey, for example. Indeed, if the weight increase in spring or summer, we can think that it's probably a flow of honey, and then the beekeeper can act accordingly following this new gathered information they will gather through like an internet platform most of the time, or an app on his phone. But there's also more complex sensors, such as the use of microphones or humidity sensor or bee counters that simply counts the bee going in and out and give you like a good estimation of the size of the hive. But for example, microphone could be used from some interesting knowledge, like for example, it would be possible to detect swarming. For that, swarming is basically when most of the beehive leave with the old queen. So it's the way that hive reproduce, like bee organism reproduce in a way. But we also have some interesting study recently that showed that certain sound, like certain hives under certain disease, could actually produce different type of sounds, and that microphones could be used to detect early on this disease and prevent the spreading of them. Whereas it could sound a bit outside of the field of beekeeping, it's quite important to stress that the relationship with bees has always evolved via technical means. We, as beekeeper, we always try to monitor bees by any means available to us. Probably started by listening to them and then observing them from a side, and then slowly using prosthetic tools and different type of technology to increase a sort of intimacy. So intimacy with bees mainly evolve and stem from the use of digital prosthetic tools by beekeeper. But how of a deal breaker could we say that smart hive could be for beekeeping? And this technology is kind of sold as a way to save times and be more efficient and help beekeeper to take better care of their bees. Finally, all of that sounds quite promising, but it's also, when you delve deeper a bit in it, you start to raise some concern. And as Bernard Stiegler taught us, to always consider technology as pharmacon, and studying them from a pharmacological point of view, which means that at the same time they could be a poison or a remedy. So all of this sounds quite promising, but it's also, after a few years of doing some ethnography about this and seeing how beekeepers use them and mostly seeing how they've been kind of marketed as a new technology that would save the bees, we can quickly see that they are sort of misused and come with a clear capitalist and productivist agenda. The main argument is you will produce more honey, you will be way more efficient and precise as a beekeeper, and even some company promise you're going to save the bees. So producing more honey could be obviously important for a certain type of practice in beekeeping, but at the same time, not really for bees, and it's clearly part of a kind of a specific trend in beekeeping, which we could call sort of a productivistic trend. Secondly, the other argument, which is a bit fallacious, is the idea that that's going to save the bees. So it's a good idea to save the bees, but I do doubt that it will be through information technology, at least not in the first place, or not as the main outcome, because we know basically the threat against bees quite know for a few years now. It's mostly the intense use of pesticide and global warming, which is the case for most of insects, especially in Europe. However, we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss this technology, because as Marx told us, whereas machinery is the perfect agent of capital, it would be a mistake to think that machines themselves are capital per se. And I believe that as soon as they are extracted from capital and colonialist imperatives, they no more perform it or perform for it. And more than trying to not use this technology would be to try to extract them from their agenda and use them in a better type of practice in beekeeping, and trying to use them toward the idea of care and intimacy. So there's basically two main interests that kind of came out after my ethnographic research about this forthcoming of digital technology for beekeepers. Was firstly that connecting all these hives together could create a sort of sensing layer, like a global network of beehives that will help beekeepers to connect between each other, but also learn about the activity of beehives in the near area or far area, and trying to generate a large quantity of data that could be used from amateur beekeeping to manage the apiary and the hive in a better way, but also ultimately create a large amount of data for different scientific community from different fields, such as ecology or any type of other biology field. You could create an immense, basically, database of kind of citizen science that could be used after for exploring deeper the world of bees. But this is not the main focus of the short presentation tonight, because then it will bring us somewhere else. But I would like to focus to the other point that I kind of spotted during doing this ethnography, which is that this technology seems to also help beekeeper to develop new sort of intimacy, or to use the words of Jake Metcalf, to develop intimacy without proximity. So this leads us to what I introduced at the beginning, and the project I developed in reaction of my ethnography about the forthcoming of smart hive. So the project is called the Intimacy Machine, and it takes the form of a web platform. So it's an ongoing archive, basically, which collects academic knowledge about bees, and that offer access to them, but not mainly through text-based media. I will copy a link after the presentation in the chat so people can explore it. But the idea is to offer an access to this knowledge to viewer, beekeepers, or bee aficionados through the means of video, images, sounds, basically non-text-based media, while at the same time access to the sources and the knowledge of the research itself is always available, but not at the first layer. So the idea definitely stems firstly from the seducing proposition of intimacy without proximity. And at the time of the pandemic, when we learn or relearn to understand bodies as various carrier, but also potential savior, it seems important to rethink this question of intimacy and touch and proximity, and what it would mean for a post-pandemic and and current ecological crash world that we live in. So this term, as I said before, was coined by Jacob Metcalfe while studying grizzly bear. So it showed that while having a large importance in many cultures, humans usually don't encounter grizzly as such, which probably good. And he argued that despite being temporally and spatially distant, grizzly bears and humans have developed surprisingly intimate relations. Following this kind of idea and focus, Benjamin Bratton's in his last book, The Revenge of the Real, kind of focus of the importance of questioning the infrastructure and to develop what he calls positive biopolitics. And I would just like to quote him briefly here when he says, I quote, Jean-Luc Nancy, commenting on touch and touchlessness, describes how all touch is ultimately and finally touchless. That touchlessness is the basis of our intimacies. It reminds us how even the most intimate encounters are mediated by sight and sounds, machines, bodily fluids, membranes, and previous behaviors. And he continued by saying, it may come through a recognition that societal care is not only a personal, face-to-face and skin-to-skin experience, but something that also happens at a distance, through impersonal system upon which we rely. So one of Bratton's main arguments follow a recent trend in the left, which is to reconsider the importance of taking the question of infrastructure and technology as primal matters, to show that we need to seize this mean of monitoring and production, and not in order to destroy them, but as a crucial for any possible future. And it is the other fold of the intimacy machine, basically, which is the idea to design a blueprint for a better usage of these beekeeping tools, like outside of any like productivist or capitalist agenda. But now I will end off a talk, and I will show you some videos that are present on the platform, just to give you a bit of an idea of the broader scope of data. So normally it should come now. Perfect, thank you. So basically this was developed by Kim Berge and his team at Aarhus University in Denmark. The idea was to develop an algorithm that can basically count varroa mites, which is mites that are really threatened for bees nowadays. And then this, just by installing a camera in the front of the beehive, then the algorithm, the camera counts the infection of the hive, and then the beekeeper can act accordingly and treat the hive or not, and kind of counts directly the number of varroa, which is really important for managing this pest. So while it's quite an expensive technology still, it's working quite well, and we can hope to have this type of technology included in our practice not that far away in the future. But that's not really the case of all of the data present on the platform. For example, if I show you the next video, sorry, it's just loading, but it's quite quick. Okay, so this is another algorithm developed by Tim Landgraf at the Freie University in Berlin. And we can see a bee basically performing what was discovered by Karl von Frisch in the 20th century, which is called a bee dance, which is like a figure of 8 loop shape, which basically the bee is used to transmit information about food location or water food location, and it gives the distance and the direction where to fly for the bees according to the position of the sun. So this algorithm was developed, and can recognize like this pattern of bee dance, and we can easily think that we know how to decipher it, and we can easily imagine that in a quite far away future we could have like certain type of camera in beehive that could tell beekeepers like, yeah, your bees are at the moment going there or there because of this algorithm deciphering the communication. And I will just show last video, should be on time, which is also part of the same lab in Berlin. So also developed by I'll cut the sound, but developed by Team Landgraft. And here we can see basically a robot bee that they built. So the bee is, they try to develop this robot in order to recreate a dance and trying to attract other bees to go to the location they want. So basically the idea, the more global idea would be through the robot to be able to send bees on a specific location or force bee to avoid a specific location where it's too much pesticide, for example. This is really still in the development phase. Basically, like it works a few times, but not all the time. So it's quite complex to send them where they want, but there's still some successful essays, which is really exciting, and which in a really far-fetched future, like that's really more speculative. So it's also good. It's a good gradation of what we can find on the platform, from data that's almost implemented nowadays and some that would probably not be implemented before like at least 40 years. But like we could imagine having like a robot in a beehive and tell our bees where to go, or like tell them what to avoid, where to go. So this was, I will just copy and put the link in the chat, and I will put it also on the YouTube chat after. But thank you very much for listening, and and let's stop there.
Thank you. Great research. Very original and very complex, because actually it seems to be pragmatic and aesthetic at the same time. Would you think that there's more emphasis on the one or the other aspect, the pragmatic useful or the aesthetic useless?
I guess the pragmatic. Yeah, I guess the pragmatic, even though, I don't know, I have more of a background in aesthetic, or at least in form creation, which I always try to keep along. But when it clashes between both of us, I probably at the moment still choose the pragmatic position. But I don't know, I do believe that there's a kind of a way of balancing them. And this is also part of at least the art I try to practice. But
another question, or maybe Stefan has one.
Actually, I also shared the intimate. The link was now shared in the chat section. And,
thank you.
And there was a comment here by Professor Betello. A Varroa counter for bees. That's very interesting. Can be really useful. Yes, concerning the usefulness, you also made a side comment concerning the financial aspect. Because I mean, and you were a bit hesitant in the sense because it demands you have to place a camera, the programs, maybe a robot there as part of the beehive, which can be quite a complex and maybe even expensive devices, which in the end for producing, if you use it for pragmatic purposes, that might not be so feasible because of the high costs involved. As a very
a lot.
At the moment, it's definitely not something that could be used on a large scale. I guess it's only used like as university experiments, but I guess it could be more interesting, not only on the financial aspect, but also like the ecological impact, because the creation of that many like electronic device, and that, as we know, is also a large part of the problem when it comes to technology. Then it could be more interesting to think about that as having certain hubs. So having like, for example, 1 or 2 hubs per area, regions, like when you could have those kind of central monitoring beehives that would be then accessible from beekeeper around, rather than having everyone his own, basically every hive having its own smartphone at the end. But yeah, it's definitely like not for tomorrow and maybe for never, but who knows. But I guess for the moment, it's more about how we can create a global network of those type of hives, and not individual for an individual practice, more like for a communal practice, relying on this sensor layer that would include themselves in the daily usage of beekeeping. But no, not directly yet.
Thank you.
Do you envisage the possibility that these bees might defend themselves from the intrusion?
Yeah,
and
I mean,
maybe modify their behavior.
They do. Sorry.
No.
They do quite. If you put any any things in the hive, they usually cover it with what we call propolis, which is this type of cement that they use to. If there's an animal coming in the hive and dying, then they will cover it by this to protect from any disease or spread of disease. And they use also this cement to block the entrance of the hive. So they react quite quickly. So when you put a camera, you have to clean it quite often, or they defend themselves quite actively. They're not really they don't really seem to be disturbed, at least by any of these sensor, or as long as they don't really move and stay in the corners. But they obviously the more invasive would be, the more problem will come about how to integrate it as a hive. So yeah, they're clearly aware of any intrusion in the hive, and they do act on it. So they could how you say create false data or anything, probably not on purpose, but
many thanks for these interesting reflections and
go back to
videos
later.
So yes, we'll come back in the end. We'll have the final discussion. We'll come back to that. And Prunella, you will move on to our next speaker, our colleague
Marco Ferrari. Marco Ferrari is professor of video art and cinema at John Cabot University. He's Italian but lived in Chicago for a long time, worked with Theaster Gates until he decided wisely to come to Rome, because Chicago is Chicago, but Rome is Rome. And he makes his videos, art videos, which are wonderful in the sense that he brings sensations and thoughts at the same time in his videos. So we can feel the kind of peaceful contemplation, at the same time getting critical about issues that can be social and political, and is quite committed to political art, I would say. Thank you, Marco, for contributing.
Thank you. I'm just trying to see if I can. I'm going to remove this
video. Maybe you can say something about XNIA. It would be interesting. That is a video.
Yes, I have. I'm trying to share. Yeah, I'm trying to share the screen now. I don't know if you're able to see it.
It is uploading.
Okay, there we go. Thanks for the introduction. And so I'll just talk about this project I've been working on called Porta Maggiore. And the video that I'll show will kind of loop back into this project. The final video I'll show is a projection, a documentation of a projection. And basically, when I moved from Chicago to Rome, I ended up in this area of Rome called Roma Est, and it's kind of delineated by the orange, somewhat abstract triangle. And basically, all of Rome has wonderful spaces where nature and the built environment kind of combine and join. Rome being layered with thousands of years of history, it's a really interesting space, and so my project Porta Maggiore really looks at the relationship we have with built and natural environments. And when I came to Roma Est, it's this area of Rome that is eastern part of Rome, and is probably the most recently developed after World War II. Different from maybe the other places is it was pretty much countryside. And so there was a huge amount of development, urban development after World War II, and much of it not very well regulated. And so we can even see in the kind of green spaces here that yeah, all of Rome has wonderful spaces, and even Roma Est, but a lot of these spaces are between public and private. They're abandoned spaces, spaces that don't necessarily have any kind of sense of belonging or belonging to communities. So within Roma Est, I was introduced to a kind of residential comitato di quartiere, like a residential group. And they kind of showed me this energy of activism that basically is part of this film. The film that I'm focusing on, and I've been documenting the last 4 years, again, focuses on the built and natural environment, but I focus on a lake, a natural lake that was made by an architectural mistake. And so the community in Roma Est kind of has been inspired by this natural monument. And so I not only kind of document the area around it and all the kind of political, social tensions, but then also this natural environment. So let me see here. So the kind of reason why I named it Porta Maggiore is at the kind of beginning of Roma Est, there's this gate called Porta Maggiore. It's a confluence of 8 aqueducts that come together, Roman aqueducts, and so it kind of created this space of this liminal space of historic Rome into the periphery of Rome. Again, periphery where Roma Città Aperta was filmed by Rossellini, where Pasolini filmed his first films, Accatone and Mamma Roma. And so a really interesting space. And again, the energy that I encountered in Roma Est by the community, by the residents, you know, there was a seed there that came, and it came, here we see the kind of US military coming in during the liberation of Rome, and they came through Roma Est. And the reason why they came through Roma Est is there were many anti-fascists, there were partigiani, resistance fighters that allowed for them to come through this space. So Roma Est contains this kind of spirit of activism, a spirit of doing what's right, of claiming areas that want to be you know, served for the public and public good. So when I heard about this lake, this strange lake that's natural, but that is or was created by an accident, the Comitato di Quartieri, which is a resident group, brought me to the Parco dell'Energia, which is what we see here. And this is an area that used to be all a factory called SNIA, S-N-I-A, and they would produce viscose, basically synthetic material. And so what we see here in the lower left-hand corner is a space that is squatted, is occupied by a group called Centro Sociale ex SNIA, and they create cultural events, family-based events, and book fairs, very embedded into the area. Where we see the red star is where the forum meets, and it's basically a group that meets with the municipality as kind of a medium between the municipality and the territory, and they meet once a month. And the forum, the Centro Sociale, the occupied space, and the resident group, they basically have been taking care and maintaining this park, which up until the 80s was abandoned and just disregarded, and since the 80s have been taking care of it and allowing for this space to be for the public. What we see in the lower right-hand corner are the remaining buildings for the factory, which is, this part is still privately owned. And in the upper right-hand corner is this infamous lake. And so the lake is really interesting because it is a point of biodiversity, is a point now, it's a migratory, for migratory birds, a space where nature and the relationship between nature and man has really been interesting, and there seems to be a harmony, even though there's this continuous tension from the outside. Just a little bit of history. The Znia factory, this was the aerial footage of the entire space. We can see that there's basically countryside here. This is 1930s when it was first built. It was sponsored by Mussolini, and is really the reason why the area in Roma Est began to develop. And so we see here the factory. We see here there are many workers coming from the northern Italy and southern Italy, many young women. And so we also, through the archive that the resident group was able to retrieve, saw basically at the factory they were keeping tabs on every single person, giving their kind of political background. And so there is also kind of here the bedrock of these labor movements and movements of asking for women's rights, for workers' rights. And so again, the spirit of activism in this area of Roma Est is something that I was introduced to, and the factory was kind of the beginning of that. So here we can see an article of basically describing this construction mistake and kind of the idea of uniting a neighborhood. Again, just some images, archival images of how the lake was formed. So after the factory closed down in the 60s or 70s, this developer Pulcini bought the entire area. He had every right to do that, but he did not have the permission to build. And he, like a lot of developers in Rome and in Roma Est, kind of will build and then pay the fines. And so, he just began to build. And we can see here that while the construction of this like commercial mall was being excavated, a water started to form, and a lake started to grow and develop. He tapped basically into a main water vein that is called Acqua Bulicante, which then feeds into the Agnina River, which then goes into the Tiber River. And so the lake found its natural natural water level, and basically he didn't know what to do. At this point, the community found out what was happening, and from about the early 90s to the mid 2000s, this space was kind of closed and protected while trials were going on. And then in the early 2000s, the neighborhood occupied the lake and basically said this needs to be for public use. And now we can see with these images how this wonderful, interesting, bizarre image and space developed. This again is the parking lot that Pulcini was building. Underneath the water are still a crane, there's still scaffolding, and this kind of process, this natural process, this organic process of just continuity and being protected, not having the kind of too much interaction with development allowed for this to unfold. And so we see here the community, they have the Senegalese community who open and close the gates to the lake every day. They build places for children to be and enjoy and to learn, especially during COVID, during the lockdowns. A lot of schools use this space to teach about biodiversity, just to teach about the environment. And we also see kind of new activists coming abroad from just their understanding of what was happening. And again, basically the community are asking for the lake and the entire area to be a natural monument. They received permission, or they received the actual natural monument from the region for about 1/3 of the space, and so now they're asking for the entire area. Here we can see just kind of scientists, important scientists talking about the biodiversity of the space and the importance that it has within Rome. And again, the area that is a natural monument is in red, and the old factory is still now going to be the next step for the activism. But where my work kind of comes in is the idea that I saw this space, I saw the energy there, and I wanted to tell a story of this area, tell the story of the tensions and the kind of idea of the natural and built environments coming into contact with one another. And so I kind of developed the story of a director searching for a story, and as he travels through the different quadrants of Roma Est, begins to understand maybe more about himself than of filmmaking. And so it's a question also of the idea of making, what is the process of filmmaking? What is the idea of capturing? What is the idea of producing work? And so I began the idea that while this director was kind of searching for this story, he would have dreams of these interactions with nature and the environment. And so I devised this kind of idea to do 12 or 14 outdoor projections. I call them foreign nocturnal projections, and trying to project images of nature and the images of organic forms interacting with different materials. So here we see I projected bees, and they have beehives there at the lake. So that was the first project. And basically, I just kind of continued with this idea. Let's see here. And then went into projecting kind of other organic forms, jellyfish on the trees of the lake. And again, the idea was to experiment, to use cinema as an organic way of interacting with public space, of creating these kind of moments where the public could interact with the images, where I would be exposed to the environment, and then these projections would then be recorded as well, and then enter into the larger project of the film. And so maybe now I will see if I can add, I will show the video now that I wanted to show initially. 1 second. So maybe now we can show this video. Thank you. We don't need to see the entire video, but this is just a documentation of the last projection I did. Again, there were 14 total, and this is me at the lake now, projecting onto the concrete structure, projecting archival material from the factory onto this structure. They call the structure the monster, or the skeleton. And so again, the idea of creating kind of an imperfect cinema, a cinema that is constantly growing, and it's you know, a process of making that is different for me in terms of you know, having a production schedule, having a definite timeline to finish. I began this project 4 years ago, and so now I'm editing it, but the projections were just kind of evolving as I interacted with the community, as I became friends with them, as I became you know, more familiar with this space, and so here we kind of see text from the archives, sometimes, you know, photographs projected back into the space. So it was an intimate viewing. There were probably just like 12 or 15 people there. You know, some other projections are more public that I had with this project, but I thought this was a really kind of special moment in terms of my process of making the work, where I could see how cinema could kind of be more organic, kind of remove myself from the idea of creating something that necessarily is for a larger public, but is for a community, and that gives a sense of meaning and importance to that community. And so, yeah, it really also opened up my eyes in terms of just thinking about also the market of art, right? And before Brunella and Stefan, you know, talked about the idea of the artist and where can artwork live. And yeah, kind of from Chicago, I'd grown tired of the idea of institutions pushing artists, grants, and all the kind of framework and hierarchy that is within the art world, and really was exposed to this idea of a horizontal way of making work and having that work live and breathe. And now I just have to finish the film, but yeah, there were kind of many lessons learned through these experimentations, through these projections. So I will kind of end the presentation here, and thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Marco. Great project, ongoing project, endless project. I think we've done there. Anyway, it's so unique what you're doing actually, and the way you take advantage of this space, which is a perfect example of a hybrid space in which nature, rather than interacting with the artificial, seems to have a conflicted relationship with the artificial. That is the scaffolding, this parking place meant to impose itself on this natural environment, which was not actually natural because it was a former factory. But nature seems to take revenge on it and take over. So instead of having a symbiosis here, we may have an example of conflict, which produces something so beautiful and interesting. So we have this absolutely unique landscape, this scaffolding meshed with the the vegetation. And if I'm not wrong, there's a local flora and fauna that was not there before. It's interesting now. They're studying also how it is possible that this flora and fauna have developed only in this spot. So I have a question. This is obviously political art. Do you think that all art is political? Going beyond our topic, but actually it is a topic in our, because when you consider the blurring of distinctions that artists do, are they doing something political? Is it political action?
I think so. I think when you put yourself in a public space, in the public sphere, then what you say or what you don't say is political. Yeah. So I think that it's a responsibility. It could be the politics of beauty. It doesn't have to be necessarily a political, a political view or something, but I think you have to stand by what you're making. Definitely.
Maybe you could say a bit more about sort of the process of your filmmaking. I mean, you've done a lot of research, sort of historical research. You've lived there in the environment. You've found the various traces. Who owned the place? What was done with the place? Did they have the right to construct something? What happened afterwards? You've collected sort of the photos from the other historical documents. And then I guess the film was not, I mean, it's not a linear narrative concerning the historical development. No, you've blended in the various lines, but in a dialectic manner, I would assume. I mean, how you brought together in the film, in the process, what you.
Yeah, I mean, my filmmaking isn't like direct in general, so I'm very interested in fragmented storytelling and the idea of kind of editing spatially, so multiple screens, or and so that kind of led me to this project where I have to have a documentary type of hat on in terms of being truthful to the story as much as I can or as much as I know, but then to create a work that can be maybe screened in one channel, so in one frame, but that can have multiple narratives happening at different times. So that's what I'm kind of working on now, and having one audio track that kind of connects everything. So yeah, my process was just going to the meetings, documenting the meetings, and then I would ride my bike into the areas of Roma Est on the weekends, because I thought it was really important to look at the surrounding areas and this kind of overdevelopment. And so I would go out there into these fields that you don't know who owns what, and just set up the camera and do these kind of long landscape, long shots, and then kind of allow time to unfold in these more open spaces. So it's kind of a mix between documentary and more more video art, I guess you could say. So the final result will be we shall see. I plan on finishing it for May next year and then present it next summer here. Yeah.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
Many thanks for your careful presentation, detailed presentation. I've sort of followed the various steps, heard about them, and now I'm quite intrigued and looking forward to seeing the final film work you're working on. You've been producing for some time.
I do think No, I think it's just interesting, the landscape and the structure of that skeleton, you know, and thinking of it being re-embodied with images, you know. I thought that was an interesting moment in the projection. So I'm glad you appreciated it.
A lot. So many thanks again to you, Marco. I will be coming to our next speaker now. And
Professor Suraka, she's a professor of literature and art at John Cabot University. She's mainly a writer, I would say, who after holding a PhD at Yale, she taught at La Sapienza in Rome, anthropology of art. She taught and she teaches at Temple University. She's a great erudite. You can ask her anything about anything, and she has also the answer and the quick quote about someone. So thank you, Nefeli, for contributing to this seminar. Looking forward to listening.
Thank you, Brunella. Can you hear me well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, this time I'll only ask questions. I have no answers. I would like to pose it here, merely a few questions centered on human nature and necessity. I hope I will get some answers. Conscious that our role is mainly to ask better questions, as we know. So I will try to raise questions that have to do with our approach to science, therefore to our existence and the manipulation of animaloids and plantoids. So one question would be, are we as humans aggressive and ferocious, or are we unnecessarily so? And I'll try to explain why I'm asking this question. So our modern fascination with behavioral sciences stems from our historical desire to explain and control our human behavior. Being able to foresee, to predict our actions is perhaps the main reason why we thought of logically structured approaches to anything and everything. From the world around us, we quickly moved to the one inside us. Geometry systematized the starry sky above us. But what about the moral law inside us? How to systematize that? It is perhaps because we started by using reliable and replicable ways to organize the chaos of natural events that we kept using the same methods to investigate, tame, and restrain our inner chaos. It seems that we as humans have less issues with our innate cruelty than with our inner chaos. Even in psychology, a branch of philosophy we call today science, so even in psychology, the major syndromes are defined by the inability of the subject to accept chaos. Autism is defined as the inability to predict behavior and to fully understand relationships of cause and effect. Depression is defined as the inability to accept adverse events for what they are, chaotic and governed by chance. Narcissism is defined as the inability to conform to external expectations from society or other humans, and so on. Give men a structured, predictable world, and they will be happy. And we don't need to call Dostoevsky here into question. The gospel will suffice for this principle. So let me make a linguistic example of what I mean, drawn from my experience working with different languages. So the American society is supposedly the ultimate evolution of the human race in terms of life expectancies, freedom, equality, although we can all see how ironic this definition can turn out to be sometimes, well, that society embarked on a struggle to regulate even promises. A promise, what used to be a byproduct of faith or desire, by postulating that future events and emotions could be under the absolute control of a single individual, becomes now some sort of law of nature. They call declarations during a wedding vows. And like children hold their parents to their promise to play soccer outside, even if it's raining, adults hold other adults to their promises, even when sickness, war, or catastrophes make this impossible. This scientist, let's call it scientist approach to what can't be determined, foreseen, and regulated is indeed the ultimate evolution of the human race, because it's an attempt at a solution to our eternal problem, controlling chaos. Perhaps the ethical problems we have with the manipulation of plants into plantoids and of animals into animaloids comes from an unavoidable skepticism towards this very scientific approach. And let me make a very mundane example. My cat lives in a semi-wild environment. He does not try to explain or regulate the world around him, nor does he feel that what surrounds him is really predictable. He always sleeps with the proverbial one eye open because he knows that something unforeseen might happen at any moment. And he's not unhappy because of this. He studies, and how human is this verb, right, that I'm using for a cat, but he studies habits and movements of birds and lizards. And of course, he elaborates some sort of system of reliable action, reaction, or cause and effect when he is in pursuit of a prey. But Dr. Thackeray, who studied cats for his whole life, noticed that these animals do not learn the way humans do. It takes several attempts for a cat to acquire a stable knowledge of things, sometimes in ways that appear erratic to us humans. When a cat manages, for example, to pull a lever that releases food after several attempts, he does not just go straight to put that lever again in the future. He keeps going through the same series of attempts for a long time. We tend to interpret this as proof of lesser intelligence compared to humans. But what if we thought of this behavior from a cat's point of view? A cat is not dismayed by the chaos of the universe. He doesn't get anxious because what happens does not equate perfectly with what he expects to happen. My cat, for example, is bothered by the wind and the rain. We open the door for him when he asks to be let out. If it's raining, though, he looks puzzled at the world outside. He wants to go out. He wants to play in the sun, but he can't. Lately, he started asking me to change the weather, or at least this is my interpretation of him looking outside, looking back at me, looking back outside, and then looking at me meowing. It feels as if he thinks I can change the weather, and perhaps he does, since I am the magic human who always has food ready in special boxes. And I use the term magic on purpose because this is the term we use when we want to discount an approach that is not systematic or scientific. In reality, I believe that my cat is simply disinterested in what caused rain or wind, and he is disinterested in being able to predict when it will stop. In fact, he tends to go several times to the door or to a window in the space of a few minutes, as if the mere act of watching repeatedly or from different angles could affect reality. And please, notice how my cat seems to be aware of quantum physics, and the ability to change an object by the mere act of observing it. And in fact, I was very interested by the talk about the bees and their behavior when they were interested. That's really something that is interesting to me. So I believe that the proverbial Schrödinger cat thinks that it doesn't really matter whether he is alive or dead, since he is in a box and therefore incapacitated anyway. When we build animaloids and plantoids, we in effect build humanoids, because we instill a causality and intentionality that is structurally human. And we pursue a scientific method that, as we know, was born as a method inherently anti-scientific. And I think that Professor Antomarini knows this better than I do, since she talked about Galileo. So much like Freud's analysis has a first diktat prohibiting self-analysis, while at the beginning Freud based his studies on his own self-analysis. In the same way, our modern scientific method is based on a man, Galileo, who refused scientific evidence of elliptical orbits because the circle is perfect and the movement of celestial bodies has to be perfect. It's no surprise that more modern scientific approaches like quantum theory rejected the diktat of a method based on proof as opposed to hypothesis, and prefer to postulate the existence of something instead of having to prove it through perfectly replicable experiments. We want the world to make sense. We want the chaos to be predictable by divine intervention or stringent cause-effect dynamics, which is basically the same thing. Accepting chaos, accepting we can't understand and organize or predict behavior the way we think we can predict cell meiosis, for example, would truly turn us back into animals, into beings that live happily in a world they don't understand and they don't need to or don't want to. But perhaps the difference between humans and animals is that happiness is, for us, far less important and perhaps not really the point of our existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Nefeli. Very, very poignant and humorous, as you usually are. Well, my question is, maybe Stefan has one.
Yes. And it is. I found it very fascinating to move away. These questions, these reflections were such a wonderful way of moving away from the anthropocentric perspective, and that's also how you refer to the bee example of the bees, and now you were talking about the cat, and that raises a lot of. I've actually, the issue of what does it mean to move away from an anthropocentric perspective is quite challenging. Is not so easy to answer, and I can see, within the critical posthumanist discourse, there are quite a few people who, when they reflect upon issues connected to the Anthropocene, the climate change, and in order to present a non-anthropocentric perspective, their replies sort of the challenge are the human beings. The challenge are the human beings, and it would be best for the planetary health if humans died out. And I think this is, and these are some suggestions made by some critical posthumanists. And I think this is actually a misunderstanding of what a non-anthropocentric perspective would have to imply. Because a non-anthropocentric perspective we shouldn't apply a disrespect for the human interest. Shouldn't imply that human perspective no longer get any recognition, in the sense that it would be best for the planetary health if humans would no longer exist. There is no planetary health. There is there's no planet as an organism. And what we need to consider in these consequences is how to accommodate best a human perspective? Which other perspectives are morally relevant? And that's why I thought your reflections, your questions of taking other interests into considerations raise so many important questions, and further clarifications concerning what it means to take a non-anthropocentric perspective without completely rejecting human interests altogether is quite a challenging issue, and much more difficult to respond to than is might be widely accepted. No.
I know what you mean, but it's kind of hard not to be anthropocentric when even virologists that study the distribution of viruses within the bloodstream, they equate that, and they actually built scientific models that equate the way a virus enters and distributes into an organism to the way drug dealers actually stand in corners and distribute drugs. Actually, there are logarithms that they built to actually predict the way in which drug dealers would move and change corner and actually distribute their drugs, which are identical to, viruses. So it's very difficult, because now I think of viruses as drug dealers that are, on the corners of my veins, and they're basically selling their drug to my cells that get addicted. I don't know. So yeah, it's hard.
Well, I think that, yes, unfortunately, we can only have language to explain what is not completely explainable. This is why we use these metaphors. So scientists use a lot of analogies and metaphors, as we know, because where they can't reach experimentally, they hypothesize, which means speaking. You have this question, not non-answerable, maybe question that, as Stefan points out. I have another question to you. I think that cats have a universe and deal with chaos exactly as humans do. The problem is the quantity, because animals don't get obsessional. Quantity, I mean size. Don't get obsessional about expanding the environment and expanding their universe. We are obsessional beings. This is why we want to reach the limits of the universe, which is a kind of paradox. And this is why we become anthropocentric and aggressive, as you point out. And this is why we want to make plantoids in order to understand, in order to control the way in which they work, which may be still anthropocentric. It's an enormous question. So cats don't make humanoids. They don't care about controlling systems that are not concerned, even if those systems can come into contact with them. So this is
I see what you're saying. Yeah, but also I believe, though, that the fact that cats or other animals don't need and don't want to understand, they're not bothered by understanding and explaining phenomena. Well, when you think of humans, we want to understand the movement of birds. We want to know how and why they nest and where they do that. And we observe them as little, birds growing and fluttering by. So this is why we also have compassion for birds, I think, and cats don't. So if cats were bothered, it's much like, the Stockholm syndrome, the reverse Stockholm syndrome. If you get friendly with your kidnapper, he will not kill you, right? But cats don't want to get friendly with birds, and they don't want to know them, and they should not know them or understand their reasons and what's behind their actions and their motivations. Otherwise, they couldn't be cats. So this is also, with all the criticism that we might do and say for humanity, the particular amounts of, I don't know, compassion, pity, understanding, or whatever, self-actualizing in other species, in other animals, it is particularly human and perhaps only human, because we want to know.
We want to know. This is a kind of weakness, could be taken as a strength, but it's actually our weakness that compels us to go beyond the limits of our immediate environment and maybe build technologies. This is why animal technologies are not so many as human technologies, because of our weakness rather than our strength. This is Marco Cerra.
If I may sort of add a question from the chat. The question you raised are very interesting. I personally think that every species needs to give some meaning in order to survive, as biosemiotics shows to the signs in the outer world. And here, this is the main difference, is that we as humans need to give some meaning to ourselves. What do you think about this?
Very interesting. I think that this is a longer conversation. We should, first of all, define what we mean by meaning, right? If we don't agree what we mean by meaning, to give some meaning to the world, the discussion can get very hairy, I guess. So what does it mean to give meaning to the world? It means to understand one's place in the world. If we go back to my cat, yes, of course, my cat knows it's his place in the world. But does this mean that he gives meaning to his place into the world? We need to define meaning. I'm sorry, I always go back to linguistics, but if we don't do that, I'm going to talk about something that maybe you don't mean. So, but thank you. That's very interesting.
Thank you for this stimulating, asking all these challenging questions and stimulating reflections. Many, many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Feli. Okay, at last, Professor Stefan Sogner. No, it's your turn. Professor Stefan Sogner teaches, he's a professor at John Cabot University, teaches posthuman topics, and he's the specialist of posthumanism. His latest book is called We've Always Been Cyborgs. He runs the journal Posthuman Studies, and what else? So much else that I would leave the floor to Stefan.
Thank you, Brunella, for these kind of words. Yes, what I want to do today is sort of is reflect upon the posthuman. That's what I'm currently working on in a manuscript on reflections on a philosophy of posthuman art, where also distinguish what are the most important aspects of aesthetics, which are aesthetic paradigms which have come up with the posthuman paradigm shift. And one idea is sort of the aesthetics of monsters. For example, when I think about Patrizia Piccinini's Graham, when I think about, Eduardo Cachedunia, which he showed us earlier, the aesthetics of hybridity, the aesthetics of the amorphous with Jaime del Val's micro dances videos. There's an aesthetics of becoming, for example, in Damien Hirst's 1,000 Years installation, aesthetics of twisting, when I think about Stellak's Second Life performance. There's an aesthetics of relationality, for example, in Random's International's Rain Room. There's a wonderful aesthetics of bodily plurality in Orland's Omnipresence, an aesthetics of superheroes and superheroines, like in Jeff Koons' Hulk Elvis sculpture. There's also an aesthetics of smoothness in Hajime Sorayami's Sexy Robots, or an aesthetics of kawaii in Mister's sweet paintings, for example. So there's a lot. These are sort of, I think, the 10 most important aesthetics concept which can be associated with many posthuman artworks. But all of them have something in common, and that they go beyond the traditional aesthetics which was dominant at the end in this last part of the 20th century. They move beyond sort of that Frankfurt School aesthetic understanding as it was presented by Adorno. And I want to show this with respect to the example of the aesthetics of hybridity. about which Eduardo has already talked a bit earlier at the beginning of this workshop. So in 2016, researchers from Canada and Israel convincingly demonstrated that our bodies contain numerous non-human cells, bacteria, unicellular microbes. They even said to make up the majority of our body cells. In fact, human bodies are said to consist of more non-human cells than human cells. According to Ron Milo and Ron Sender of the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot in Israel and their colleague Shai Fuchs of the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, for every 30 million human cells, that is, cells with our own DNA, there are 39 trillion non-human cells. So we are hybrids, we are crossbreeds already. And Japan has recently ruled that it is legally legitimate to give birth to a human pig chimera. Not only is it possible to create organs in this way where the probability of rejection by the recipient is low, but also the possibility of transferring and integrating non-human genes into humans could be realized by means of this research. So we've always been hybrids, and the hybridization process is progressing further given the possibilities of contemporary biotechnologies. In 2008, the UK has approved research on human-animal hybrids, but they may only be kept alive for 14 days. In the US, they are not allowed to develop beyond the 28th day. Yet even before hybrids were created, thus hybrids were realized on the basis of crossbreeding, whereby the mule is most probably the most famous example, an offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. Normally, mules cannot have offspring with one another, which is an indicator for the membership in a species. However, in rare circumstances, it has been possible for mules to reproduce without the aid of external technologies. Hybrids have been part of our culture already. A famous example is the chimera of Arezzo, a famous Etruscan bronze, which is constituted out of parts of a snake, a goat, and a lion. Chimera literally means goat in ancient Greek. Hybrid, on the other hand, stands for the mixture, but etymologically comes from the Greek hybris, which stands for the extreme form of pride. The scientist Victor and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein represents hybris when he technologically creates life. Icarus, when trying to escape from Crete by means of feathers created by his father Daedalus, also represents hybris. The creation of hybrids used to have a rather negative connotation. However, this attitude has changed in contemporary times. Chemonomini turn up as manga and anime figures, which literally means animal ears. Girls with cat ears, nekomini, are particularly well-known phenomena, who are also widely used in cosplay and costume play, whereby fans dress up as their manga and anime idols. Here, the aesthetics of kawaii, the aesthetics of cuteness, which is also a very important part of the posthuman aesthetics, comes in. It also gets connected with that of the hybrid. So it's a cute hybrid. Sort of here, the girl with the cat's ears. It's a cute hybrid, which clearly leads to a re-evaluation of attributing a much more affirmative stance towards hybrids in general. A similar move can be found in the artwork Edunia by Eduardo Katz, who is known for having coined the concept of bioart in 1997. His GFP bunny is probably the best known example of this artistic approach, as it has already entered pop culture, been discussed in Big Bang Theory and many other examples of the popular culture. It's a living, genetically modified bunny which glows green in the dark, which raises an enormous amount of art, philosophical, as well as ethical questions. However, this section is dedicated to the aesthetics of the hybrid, which is ideally represented in the work Edunia by Kach, as it is the result of a genetic intervention by means of which the petunia gets altered by means of Eduardo's DNA. Yet his genes merely produce a protein in his veins of the flower such that they receive a distinctive red color, which allows the association of human blood running through the veins of the flower. Otherwise, it merely looks like a regular flower. But knowing that the veins of the petunia contain the DNA of the artist Eduardo Kach, Hence, the name Idunia makes one wonder about the phenomenon of the hybridity of life. We've always been hybrids. We share 99.9% of genes with the person next to us. 96% of chimpanzees' genes are identical to our own. 90% are identical to a cat. 85% to a mouse, 80% to a cow, 61 to a fruit fly, 60 to a chicken, and 60 to a banana. We share 70% of our genes with the zebrafish. In the Netherlands, researchers have managed to create genetically engineered zebrafish which can generate part of their nutrition by means of photosynthesis, about 15 to 20%. This procedure made them turn green, so they're solar-powered green zebrafish. These zebrafishes have typical capacities of a fish as well as of a plant. This capacity can also be found in animals living in the sea, like in the sea slug in the Philippines. This seems to raise the issue of us humans receiving the capacity of generating the capacity of photosynthesis, such that little green humans from Mars do not have to remain a figure from science fiction. Aesthetically, Idunia is very different from the diabolic hybrids and chimeras of the past. It's a beautiful flower with blood red veins. Thus, it's much closer to cute Necomini hybrids who are a pleasure to see and to embody both the aesthetics of kawaii as well as that of hybrids. The affirmative aesthetics of hybrids, which is embodied in Idunia, is different from the more ambiguous aesthetics of hybrids, which one can find in a sculpture like Metamorphosis by Patrizia Piccinini, which also includes some monsterly elements. Including monsterly elements does not have to imply a solely critical stance concerning the technological procedures in question. Yet the critical, or at least ambiguous elements, are much stronger concerning Piccinini's Metamorphosis than in Koch's Idunia. This, however, does not make one artwork better or worse than the other from an aesthetic perspective. Different emotional associations may be also lifestyle choices get associated by combining monsterly or kawaii elements with that of the aesthetics of hybridity. And it is this move. So we're moving away in the entire sector of posthuman artworks. We're moving away from solely being focused on the aesthetic, from creating works of art solely which are meant to be solely autonomous, which are meant to create solely without any reference to extra artistic ends and purposes. So here we see, and this is the way we move beyond the aesthetics of the avant-garde as it was presented by Adorno. There are non-aesthetic elements, there are ethical elements, technological, political elements which get considered. And some might wonder about the status of these extra artistic elements. Is there a danger connected to that if we move beyond the aesthetic, between the autonomy of the aesthetic? Isn't that the risk of, again, producing something like a total work of art, which could have rather problematic implications? But the idea, the suggestion I'm trying to present is, no, these posthuman artworks are rather non-totalitarian total works of art. They produce a shift away towards a posthuman paradigm shift, presenting extra artistic elements, but without presenting them as essentialist answer, as anthropocentric answers, as dualistic answers, as new final conclusions, as new final replies to questions, but they will merely meant as suggestions, as options, as possibilities. Maybe the way it's just a recommendation. Please engage with this idea. It's no longer the hard stance which was taken by Wagner as being meant to create a new culture, but it's merely a suggestion, a fictive suggestion, which is supposed to enter into a dialogue by proposing a reflection which might provide a helpful guideline concerning extra artistic meanings which are connected to these artworks. And I think this is a particularly intriguing paradigm shift aesthetically, which goes along with the great variety of posthuman artworks. They make us engage, and they justify extra artistic meanings, and they make us engage with them without them being meant to be as ultimate essentialist replies, but merely as suggestions in order to enter into a dialogue with all the great variety of issues with which we are currently engaged in. And this is sort of the suggestion I'm trying to present in my reflections on posthumanoid. So many thanks for your attention here. I will.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much. I have a question. Well, I absolutely share your view about the prospect or the perspective of this kind of new art. But I don't think that Adorno is responsible for that, because Adorno is not the one to propose the autonomy of art that was proposed much before then, art for art's sake, art pour l'art. Adorno rather claims that art cannot be just aesthetic, because it must be a political resistance. This is why an artist must refuse to be identified as such. So Adorno is not saying art shouldn't engage with the environment. It's exactly the opposite. But of course, Adorno was wrong. Was wrong in that cinema, he refused to consider cinema as an art form, to consider jazz as a serious music. It was wrong exactly because he thought that an artist should be politically hidden, let's say hidden in the sense not be immediately recognizable socially. So jazz was too recognizable. Cinema was photography were too recognizable. He was wrong exactly, not because he claimed, not because these new art forms are extra aesthetic, however they may be, but because they were not political or aristocratic enough, paradoxically.
Yes, Steph. I mean, you're right in pointing out. Obviously, the way I presented Adorno was here really a shortcut, well, he does focus in his aesthetic theory on the autonomy of artworks, but the autonomy of artworks is meant to react in a dialectic manner. So the autonomous is supposed to reveal the relevance by focusing on the autonomy of artworks. It is meant to dialectically reveal the autonomy in the ethical field. So here we have got some extra aesthetic meaning by means of the focus on the autonomy of artworks. But as a consequence, he was very, was very critical concerning anything which was already pre-established, anything which had a longer standing history. For example, the concept of beauty. He always identified any traditional harmonious consonant understanding of beauty, as in Stravinsky, with the totalitarian, with the paternalistic, with really dangerous implications which go against sort of his understanding of the autonomy is breaking away from the historical traditions. And whenever I sort of presented bioart, actually in the context of art historians in particular, sort of the response I got was in many circumstances, also other posthuman artworks, this is too beautiful to count as artwork nowadays. Artwork cannot be that beautiful anymore. And here I'm trying to show, how we can and I haven't talked about now the concept why in how far we can justify the notion of beauty in this evolutionary, in the posthuman context. But this clearly shows the need to move beyond Adorno's approach. It does not have to be the usage of harmonious forms, of traditional understandings, notions of beauty, but not meant in the traditional way, not having the essentialist understanding. It doesn't have to be totalitarian. It could be a notion of beauty coming about as a consequence of evolutionary processes. So it needs a lot of further justifications, and not any reference beyond the aesthetic in favor of the ethical and so on does have to have totalitarian implications. It can be merely meant as a suggestion. So it is much more, so even though sort of the Adorno's approach is still quite a prevalent one within the field of art history, I think the post-human artworks have revealed some important dimensions why it is important to go beyond this rather limiting approach, and one can increase the plurality even further by allowing alternative and by allowing post-human approaches also as in the realm of something which demands proper aesthetic consideration. But that would be my far too short reply to a very complex issue, obviously.
Yeah, depends on the definition of beauty, of course.
Exactly. Beauty, that's a separate issue, but I just wanted to highlight. But we have got a couple of questions, actually, and we maybe come to the final round now, where we there were questions to Eduardo, Donina, and so on. So I will get the people back on, the participants back on the screen, who I can see. Nefeli, there is Nina, there is Eduardo. There's just been, so let me start with the first question, which came up much early on, very early on at the beginning. There was a question to Eduardo's presentation. Could he elaborate when the speaker affirmed that a product of art or of science does not have the same ethical implications of creating a human being? Maybe there's something you want to comment on? The context of changing other animals than humans?
Well, the fundamental difference is that if I were to create a work of art that involves the birth of a new human, I would be the father of this new human. I'm not seeking to expand my family, so there will be no artworks that involve the creation of new humans coming from me. That much I can assure you, if that's the question.
Thank you. And we've had the question just now also to Nina, very recent one. What does she think about the art show Body Worlds? It's a show where anatomically dissected bodies are turned into artworks and educational tools.
I'm not a huge fan of edutainment. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I used to work in plastination, and we have plastination in our departments, and that. For me, I mean, I always position myself as an artist. It's really interesting that I work between the two realms, but I always argue quite strongly that I'm an artist, and it's interesting. But yeah, I see it more as edutainment and staying away from, I think, any broaching towards being seen as artistic. I see no, but maybe that's also because I like the critical edge, and maybe to go back to the idea of offending and offending well, really offending is asking a question. It's very easy to be offensive nowadays just by asking a good question. And so perhaps what, yeah, I don't find so engaging, but I appreciate the process. So.
What do you think? I was curious because very often when I presented fields in the realm of bioart, in many circumstances, I came across the response, well, sort of the Chief Ribani, it's too beautiful to be regarded as a work of art. Art must not be that beautiful anymore. After I've got my, but I would be curious. I've got my response why I would say no. We've got a new justification for this, but I would be curious to hear your responses.
I'll start, but I come from a very traditional background, and I think that carries through with me. And I always think that there's a certain visual vocabulary and a certain syntax that I bring into all of my work, and I can't let that go, and I don't want to let it go, and I find quite a joy in it. So I don't know. I think, I mean, I do hold on to beauty in a way. I used to argue, I used to hate it when I used to go to conferences, and I've never had people tell me so much about art and so much about beauty who were scientists. These are sort of debates that didn't really come up so much for artists. I would never dare to tell an artist what art is, and the same with beauty. But I know for myself, there's a certain elegance for refining a visual vocabulary to I think I may have dropped out for a minute, but to express ideas in this way that can be felt, but then also you can keep going, and that you realize there's a whole different discourse that's happening above it. So I love engaging people as a visceral moment when they enter into a space where they're experiencing the work, and then they can also then imagine with all these sort of discourses that lay over it. So,
thank you. Does anyone else want to?
Well, I would add something to this concept of beauty, because can we say that Eduardo's or Nina's work are beautiful the same way in which Raphael is beautiful? The difference is striking. So when you hear something that I never hear, but when you hear saying that this is too beautiful, it doesn't mean that it is bad. It is a bad artwork. It only means that it is banal. So Eduardo's work or Nina's work are relevant because the beauty of what they do is not just predictable. It's something unpredictable that compels us to say this is beautiful in a way that was not possible to say before. Whereas going back to the canon, Raphael follows a canon. In any case, it doesn't look for originality. He does, but within the canon. Now we've blurred all the canon exactly because artists now look for beauty to emerge for places where beauty was not meant to be placed. So to beautiful means it's decorative, ornamental, obvious, predictable, in which case, Duchamp has opened the path to Eduardo and Nina, I think, where you can find beauty where it was not meant to be. This is why you talked about monsters. Monsters, hybrids, chimeras are exactly the attempt to surpass the limit of obvious beauty, canonic beauty.
From my perspective,
go on forever. Maybe
from my perspective, it's very curious to hear anybody talk about Jeff P. Bunny in terms of beauty, because back in 2020, when I created the work, 2000 when I first created the work, everybody talked about Alba as a monster. Nobody talked about her as being beautiful. And this is precisely why I wrote that piece that you published, Stefan, because the perception has dramatically shifted in these 20 years. So from my perspective, having gone through all the attacks and all the debates and all the misreadings and everything that has transpired in 20 years, just to hear that is extremely curious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, this was interesting a response I got quite a few times, actually, from professors of art history, and who even been engaging with the posthuman. And it was related, and then they explained it coming from the Frankfurt School background, understanding that any kind of too harmonious appearance it implies the paternalistic structures, taking over something from the past. It is not this autonomy which is needed by breaking away in the ideal from history entirely, creating a new genre without accepting any even aesthetic features, even structural features, proportional features, which is already too much. And so I understood their perspective. I didn't share it, but because there's a clear difference also when one how one could talk about harmonious structures in this altered background, because it no longer is the affirmation of eternal truths, eternal forms as of beauty, but now one can even one can talk about it from a psychological perspective, in the sense that evolutionary we have developed certain capacities which many people simply perceive as beautiful. It's an evolutionary process which is a widely shared perspective or perception of the world. So it doesn't have to imply an essentialist eternal answer representing something higher, but it could have come about as a part of an evolutionary structure with its own meanings. So the meaning of what one identifies as beautiful would have to be reinterpreted from an evolutionary perspective.
The notion of beauty evolves. Everything. Maybe Aladdin and Marco have.
I don't. Yeah, Eduardo just wanted to.
It's interesting to point out that monster etymologically comes from monere, which is a warning. And in that sense, I think that people that received G.F.P. Bunny in 2000 as a monster is because they perceived Alba as a warning of something that in their mind was undesirable, right? So those who now find Alba beautiful, what does that mean? Right? What would be the opposite of monster? What's the opposite of a warning? It's an open question, but I think that it's a question that is interesting to ask.
That is very interesting. If there is a further question, there are a couple of questions. There's one question here from the comment, if I got it right. He hopes that his works are meant to create encounter and dialogue, but encounter doesn't necessarily imply dialogue. It seems that these artworks are created for the enjoyment or interest of the humans. I understand that some of these artworks reacted to the human presence, but they had no choice. They were there, they could not leave the space or just give up on being objects of interest for us. These artworks were under our control, thus they were hierarchically below us, weren't they?
No, I don't think so. I think that the fact that you bring life into the world does not mean that you establish a hierarchy. That means that initially you may have a relationship of care, but you also have to recognize that you are in a relationship with an autonomous being that has his, hers, theirs, its own desires, volitions, life to live. We heard examples of lives shared with cats today. So I don't think the fact that you either acquire or through some other means bring a form of life into the world or into your personal life, that means that you have a relationship that is top down. Do not think so.
Agree, yes. Thank you. There were also comments thinking about when thinking about your 8-day work. I guess I see we've already progressed like 2-3 hours slot. We've been here together for quite some time. I don't see Marco and Aladdin. That's why I'm sort of, I didn't put them back on the screen. Oh no, Aladdin, here he is. He is here. So I will. And I would suggest, I would love to for all of us to make a final feedback round, a final round concerning reflections which you come up with today, which you've encountered today, which a final concluding remark by all of the participants today.
Okay, 1 minute each.
Well, yeah, just a comment, final comment. maybe we start with Nephili, if this is fine.
Conclusive remarks.
Yes. Well, I don't know. I was very happy to hear actually artists talking about their work and articulating about their works. And so this is new to me because I've been an art critic for a long time, and I usually found artists to be not really articulate. And I was very, very pleasantly surprised. And I think I will have to really think long and hard about some of the things that I heard here. And I just wanted to thank you for this. That's mine.
Nina.
Okay.
Definitely disappeared.
Just one of the things that came up, which I thought was really interesting, was the point that you made, Brunella, about the transition from Attilia to the genius to maybe now working more collaboratively. And I would absolutely say that. Sorry, I think I just dropped out, but I'm feeling this so intensely that we're working collaboratively. But it'll almost be a question I leave with you, that the Attilias that maybe had a head at the past, that had a certain identity leading it, I feel now that there's this need for spaces that have a theme or an idea that set the pace for it. Like my work with Symbiotica, it wouldn't have been as meaningful if it had been made outside that space. So I found that very exciting. And I mean, all the talks have been really, really interesting. But for me personally, that made me very excited. So thank you.
Many, many thanks, Nina. Thanks for having been here with us.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Eduardo.
Well.
Eduardo.
Grazie mille. Just wanted to thank you for the opportunity. The debate was very rich. It was great to see the artworks. It was great to hear the insights that were shared by everyone. I just look forward to the unfoldings, the becomings.
Many, many thanks, Eduardo, for having been with us. Hopefully, we'll have a chance of meeting up personally sometime too. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Marco. Marco, a few words.
Yeah, just thanks to everyone. Really stimulating conversations. And I do question about the category of hybrid. It seems as though it's just another frame to then, defragment down the line. So it seems like kind of like the Russian dolls. But all very stimulating. And thanks for everyone's time and work. It was really a pleasure to be here. So grazie.
Aladdin.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marco.
Yeah, my brain is quite steaming, but thank you very much. To all of you, and I really appreciate the kind of the horizontality approach of the seminar, of being like not feeling any hierarchy between like artist or philosopher or any other type of thinker, and I think that was really valuable. And thank you for the organization.
Thank
Many
you.
thanks for having been with us.
Stefan, if you want to.
Yes, no, it's been wonderful. It's been wonderful bringing together such an amazing group of artists, thinkers, intellectuals, and for me, it's been an enormous personal enrichment. It's the thing is, I've been working in the field for so long and being concerned with the various artworks, and it always adds an additional dimension if one directly engages with the people, has these exchanges, not just on a written, not just in not just in a written form, not just within a museum, but there is even more of an engagement now with the direct dialogical form, which is personally incredibly important for me and gives me additional insights and dimensions. And a further dimension will, for me, is always the case when we directly meet up. So I hope we will soon have the chance of again having the workshop in the presence, in getting connected together, and then going out afterwards to having a dinner, having some drinks and engaging in this personal manner. This has always been sort of the greatest enrichment. But I was extremely happy about the wonderful participants and today, and about our all of our exchanges.
I think we reached the point of discussion where something new may happen, may occur, which confirms the fact that we are in times of transition. And this is why these seminars are much more important than conferences where one presents what already knows. Okay, so these seminars are meant to project themselves into the future and project research into the future. So hopefully, as Stefan says, in the spring we have it more in presence.
In particular, because we're bringing together world-leading thinkers, artists, intellectuals, at the same time, you know, also students from university and the various participants from a great diverse of different fields, in order to engage in these reflections, which are fully challenging for all of us. I mean, we are all confronted with these new challenges, post-human challenges in the world we live in, and I think it's important to we all don't know the right answer. We all don't know what sort of how to best to respond to the challenges we deal with. The future is open, and so this hybrid interrelationships is necessary for finding maybe better responses, more appropriate new insights. And so this is why I like this. I personally, this resonates with me extremely strongly, this forum. So Prunella, I think we all say goodbye to all the listeners and participants. I will have a wonderful weekend. I will end the broadcast now.
Good.